Okay, so this technically is lesson 4. I know we've done a lot of different things with some of the other videos, but I'm going to start looking at modulation, and we'll talk a lot about chord function today too, which will um, feed into the discussions we've had about part writing, um, and actually just sort of bring together a whole lot of different things that we've been talking about. But I want to start with the Mozart Sonata in B flat. Crucial 333, which we have looked at before. Let me pull that up. And after the opening period, which we've talked about, the music begins to modulate. So I'm going to look at that, and we'll talk about that modulation. Imperfect authentic cadence. And then right here at measure 10 is the perfect authentic. And then notice the E natural here. And E naturals persist. We get occasional B naturals, but they're immediately canceled out with B flats. And then we begin here in measure 23 with the double period example we looked at previously, but we noted at that time that at this point in the music, the key is the key of F because all the E naturals persist, and we have in essence canceled out the E flat of the original B flat key signature. So what we want to look at today is how we actually accomplish that modulation. And the very first thing to recognize is that it's all about the introduction of a new accidental that then persists and in essence changes the key signature. And this modulation from a major key, in this case B flat major, to the dominant key F major, which we saw a second ago at measure 23, is one of the classic modulations, what we call the high classical modulations. Major keys in this time period, Mozart will always modulate from the tonic major to the dominant key. And then you're probably familiar that pieces in a minor key will modulate to the relative major in this time period. Okay, so that gives us sort of our first example of modulation. What we're going to look at next is the Bach cello suite. This backs up a few years, probably a few decades from the Mozart. This is the end of the Baroque period prior to Mozart. And we're going to look at the cello suite, one of the great works in G major. And if you just kind of looked ahead, you might already notice that by the bottom here, we're getting C sharps introduced into the music. So without even listening to it, here we are in the key of G with F sharp. By measure 5 into measure 6, we're introducing C sharps. If those C sharps persist, then we have in essence added C sharp to the key signature, which would move us to the key of D. And again, that's not uncommon even in the late Baroque to go from the major tonic to the dominant. So this appears to be doing the same thing. Let's listen. Da-da-dum. So just as we saw in the Mozart, once we get that new accidental that moves us to the dominant key, so here in G, adding C sharp to the music, the C sharp persists. So at this point, you might notice in this measure, we're in bass clef, we have the D major triad right here. So this is the resolution to D major, and the moment that we can say that we've effectively modulated to D, because we've got in essence a cadence in D. Okay, so the first sort of key to modulation, it's a bit of a pun, is this idea of introducing a new accidental. And if we look a little more closely, what you would begin to see is that when we introduce that accidental, that we are creating in essence the dominant chord in the new key. Okay, so thinking about to the Mozart, we started in B flat, we introduced E natural, canceling out the E flat of the B flat key signature, right? Leaving just B flat, which modulates us to the key of F, right? But that E natural, if you go back and look at the music, was part of the C, E natural, G, B flat chord, right? That is 5/7 in F. In the Bach example, I have these here, I should be looking at. When we first introduced the C sharp down here at the bottom, C sharp, G, A, G, this would be an A7 chord, A, C sharp, implied E, it's not in the measure, but implied, and then G as the dominant 7th, 5/7 in D. Okay, so the accidental that we're adding to modulate from a tonic major to the dominant key is the leading tone of the dominant chord of 5/7 in the new key, the dominant of the dominant. Does that make sense? Okay. And again, in Baroque, late Baroque into early classic period, high classic period, even into early Romantic music, this is the expected modulation. Major keys modulate to the dominant, and so it's the leading tone of the dominant that is the note that's going to move us into that new key. Okay. If you look more closely around the chord progression that makes that modulation, I've kind of charted it here in essence. So we start in an original key, right? We're headed to 5, the dominant chord in the new key, and that leading tone is going to be the accidental that is added and persists to create the modulation. Likely that's going to show up in the melody, okay? So we're moving from the original key over to the dominant of the new key and then resolving to the tonic in the new key, and that creates the modulation. What in terms of sort of describing and understanding how modulation works, it often is dependent on this chord that comes right before the dominant in the new key, what may appear in we call a pivot chord. And here it's important to understand sort of chord function overall. And this is a chart that I've created over the years. Other books have different sort of charts, but these show sort of how chords tend to resolve to each other. And I like thinking if we look at the chord function of these, which I introduced in the part writing videos, and notice that some chords are what we call tonic or tonic expansion. Some chords are predominant that move to the dominant key. Chords resolve in terms of part writing most often by their function. Okay, so we'll get to all of these chords over time, but this does give you a sense of how chords tend to resolve in chord progression. And again, if you know their functions, tonic and the tonic expansion chords, which are 3, 6, and 4. 4 can be either tonic or tonic expansion, or it could be tonic expansion or predominant, depending on whether it resolves back to 1 or whether it resolves onto the dominant chord. Tonic expansion chords tend to resolve by common tones. Predominant chords, the 4 and 2, as they resolve to 5, tend to resolve by contrary motion. The bass tends to move up, the upper voices tend to move down. Dominant chords resolve by sensitive pitch. The leading tone of the dominant tends to resolve up, and the 7th of that chord resolves down.